This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
We learn that people slip, it's only human. Errors show the path to grow and we're improving. Context shakes the way we do our best work. Focus on the system, no blame can hold us back. 5 hot principles lifting us higher. Learning without blame, fueling our fire. Together we grow, together we thrive. Keeping operational excellence alive.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to Season 6 and the 127th episode of the podcast show, Hop into Action. The show is an ongoing discussion about building a better community of practice for people and organisations who want to improve safety, quality and operational excellence using HOP, learning teams, 4Ds and other learning frameworks. Today is part 1 of a 2-part series with Ben Hutchinson. Ben is not only a seasoned senior health and safety leader, but he also has a deep interest in safety research. Ben operates the site safetyinsights.org and is the host of Safe as Podcast, where he posts and talks about safety research summaries in a way that is relatable for others to learn from. Part 1 is about unlocking knowledge and deconstructing blame. Ben explains his motivation for posting academic research online, the frustration that valuable safety research is often locked behind paywalls, making it inaccessible to the practitioners who need it to improve their work, and stresses the importance of cultivating curiosity among safety practitioners regarding the existing body of knowledge. So please sit back and enjoy the series of Hop into Action. Hey, welcome, Ben. It's been a while since we've had a podcast, and I couldn't think of anyone better suited to start off with the series by having a chat with you, because I really admire the work that you're doing, which is, bringing all this great science-based information in a way that's more relatable to people. So maybe we kick off. What sat behind it? What was the purpose? What was in your brain? What were the voices saying?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for inviting me on. We've obviously spoken a fair bit over the years. I really respect and value your, particularly like the ground level. You're very much in the weeds of doing the work. So I've always found that quite a good contrast to the stuff that I've been sort of putting on LinkedIn. So really the key reason why I started posting, let's say, research online was out of a frustration. We have this whole sort of system of research, and it's not just safety, it's everywhere. And it's primarily written for people in the academia, published in academic journals, locked behind paywalls that only academics and universities can access. It's I sort of had this existential crisis in a sense around, in safety, for instance, what is this, or who is this actually serving? Now, there's a more of a philosophical level around, scientific evidence, knowledge advancements. It has multiple different goals, but I was thinking about safety practitioners and what we have to sort of balance and do. And since most of this information was locked behind paywalls, that was my motivation, was to try and unlock some more of it. I had access to a lot of this research. So I really started quite small. It was just here's the abstract and here's a couple of dot points from the full paper. That's all it was. I started doing that probably around 2011 or 12, just very basic. I didn't cover any papers that were fully accessible online. If it was an open access, it was really just ones that were locked behind paywalls. So that was the whole motive, was just to unlock some of this stuff that really should be about improving practice and helping practitioners that they couldn't actually access because it's locked behind layers of paywalls.
And I think from your point of view, I mean, the observation from me as an external is we're trying to make these practitioners a bit more curious, because there is an amazing body of work, there is an amazing body of knowledge that's sitting there. And even just taking a couple of nuggets from it is just so vital. I remember, I think it was earlier this year, I was participating in some content with David Woods around the whole thing of error. And, in his book, they kept talking about that first story, second story narrative. And for me, that was like this compelling narrative, because immediately that made sense to leaders. And it wasn't a question of how Woods was saying it. It was a question of how we could actually take that and make that relatable. Because good learning takes time. And what we discovered on our journey was that because good learning does take time, you're creating a void. And leaders can't sit and do nothing whilst you learn. So the problem is they feel they have to fill the void. And what are they filling the void with? Who failed? Why they failed. And of course, one could take from that reading is that we're effectively blaming leaders rather than actually just saying we're actually creating the environment where leaders are being forced to actually do something, because leaders have been trained to act on things, not sit back and wait, because the person above them is not going to say, oh, that's okay, another 2 weeks is okay. Okay, everyone wants answers. And of course, the higher the potential or the worse the consequence, the more pressure builds. So is that quite a good example of how someone could take something and try and do something with it?
I think what you've just said there, there's so much we can unpack from there. There's probably 5 or 6 different points running through my head. So yes, I just find it really interesting with, this isn't just safety, but so I think it was Drew Ray and others that argued around anxiety reduction. That's one of the core sort of goals of safety. Now, it's not what we intend, but safety has this effect of reducing anxiety. I find it interesting around investigations. When you read some investigations, quite a lot actually, they're so clinical, they're so inert of qualities that make us human. So you go back to the earliest records of human language and writing, documented language. It's very expressive typically, like imagery, graphics, symbols. It conveys a lot of meaning. And then you take these investigations and they don't have any of those qualities that make us really useful sort of stories. Now, I'm not talking about like the Odyssey or something. Like, we're not trying to write the Odyssey with an investigation, but we've stripped them of a lot of this convincing sort of informal, soft sort of information that humans helps make sense of information. So you're talking about like the first stories. They're very much first stories, quite a lot. Like if you look in construction, ICAMs, by default, it forces us into categories to create first stories. Now, there's a lot of really good ICAMs out there too, because the tool itself doesn't make the value of something. Like, you can work beyond that, and there's nothing inherently, I think, wrong with ICAM. I could have picked any sort of other framework. But to the point around the second stories, you look at how we don't have to create one source of truth. We can have multiple overlapping narratives. We can just take it from the supervisor's perspective, the worker's perspective. By trying to force a single narrative of how we think the event happened, we risk actually reducing the amount of insights we can extract from it. So I talk about how we try and solve yesterday's incident that's already happened, and we're completely blinded to tomorrow's. How to construct safer, more reliable, effective work, better work tomorrow. And I think that's what these first stories can do. They do have a place, and elements of them do have places. Like, they do help us describe. If it's machinery, first stories can definitely help us understand very mechanical, linear sort of causal mechanisms of machinery. But to describe how it got to the stage where it wasn't picked up, it wasn't resolved, it could be really valuable to talk about the sort of the softer sides of that, the pressures, the conflicts, goal conflicts, applicable standards across industry that had only been adopted within certain organizations. there's a lot of stuff we can really extract from them. And I think these first stories become, rather than a tool to help us sort of succeed, they become really quite a thought on our side that limits our imagination. And that's not imagination as far as creating made up things, but talk about counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are a very normal human thing to think about what could have happened, what could be. We use it for improving work. Like, and I think that's one of the dangers of first stories, or maybe a limit of them, is it can quite actually limit the amount of other insights we can draw out, because it forces it potentially down a very narrow path.
And I think, once again, I think Decker talks about that with the tunnel. I think Honagel explores that with the circles, where he basically has accidents, incidents, and everyday work, where he basically says that if you focus on the accident, you're going to see low frequency, low similarity. But if you go out to normal work, you'll see high frequency and high similarity. And once again, I think everyone's saying the same thing. It reminds me of the movie Don't Look Up. Rather than looking in the tunnel at the event, we should look out first. Because to be honest, the most boring part is actually what happened, because the how it happened is actually pretty straightforward, because that's an exchange of energy. The why it happened is the bit that takes a little bit more. And of course, that takes time. And I think, just once again, touching on that, if I think, once again, I'm not here to bash ICAM in any way, but PIPO is a classic example. Was the intent because it was an easy abbreviation to remember? Or was the intent to start with people?
Yeah, I mean, PIPO is not unusual either. I mean, you have 5Ms, which has existed in industry for decades. There's always going to be some iteration of that to focus people on people, on text.
I've looked at Ishikawa's fishbone. It starts organizational coming back in. Does that make sense? Because, and from me, what it tells me is that from the very beginning, we're placing, because it's then viewed as linear, it means that we're putting the spotlight on people, which means we form a bias. Same thing. If the first one was about the organization, then we put a spotlight on the organization, the bias.
Yeah, what you look for is what you find, yeah.
You can't blame an object. So that's why when we talk about learning teams, all we're saying in a learning team is we're putting the system in the center and the people around it, and asking them, how did the system support you for work to go well? Okay, because we start with learning about what everyday work looked like before we actually explore what happened on the event. Because to be honest, there's, in all my years of doing this, there's not a big shift between everyday work and what happened on the day of the event. It's not that dramatic in that space. And I know and I don't always like using the word psychological safety, but if we set workers up to talk about everyday work, they will naturally move to the event when they feel comfortable. Because I'm always been conscious about that notion of re-traumatizing people, because that's what I see a lot with investigations. And we're not only re-traumatizing them through the investigation process, we're then re-traumatizing people on the actual output. And I don't believe that's intentional. I don't believe everyone goes out to write something to do that, but that's the net result. Because I call it communication as given versus communication as received. It's really vital in that space to try and do that. And it's hard. It's hard to do that because, as you said, Ben, it's easy for the people, but it's easy. It's so obvious. And, as you said, we're wired. Counterfactuals is wiring of hindsight. Okay? It's just normal. But does it actually create change? So I agree with you. I think, this notion of taking, first of all, I hate the word investigation, but taking these things and turning them more into a narrative that anyone in the organization, from the worker to someone at the board, if they could read that as a story, see themselves in it, and take learnings from that, Isn't it the ultimate goal? And the ultimate, and then they can potentially see similar systemic drivers in what they do. That's because I hear this constant thing all the time. I don't know how you feel, but people say to me, "How do we know we've done enough?" Well, the answer is you'll never know until the next time it goes wrong.
Yeah. So just the idea about the reintroducing trauma. Anyone at home who's listening in, so if you look up second victims, so this is something healthcare has grappled with for decades. It's only really had a firm sort of term for it, second victims, since I think like the 2010s, around that mark or a bit earlier. But yeah, second and third victims. So it's just not the person that was injured or the patient that was injured. We also have to consider the clinician that was involved in that event and their trauma, and then the families of the victims. And it's not to sort of take away from the pain and the experience of the person that was injured. It's not at all. But as it's argued by like Decker and others around the just culture and the restorative culture sort of frameworks, the best, really, probably the most sensible way forward is to recognize pain exists at different levels. And instead of asking how can we, like retributive, how can we punish our way to better outcomes, is what does the victim actually need to recover? What do they need from physical and mental and psychological input?
Yeah.
And who's best placed to actually deliver what they need? Now, I haven't seen it quite as pronounced in construction, unless it's been an incident where one person has been very directly related, like maybe it was they struck another one of their co-workers with the boom on an excavator. So I've seen those examples, and they feel a huge sense of guilt. And even with using progressive sort of techniques around work insights, learning teams, I've debriefed with these people, and they still find it a deeply humiliating, traumatic. They didn't use the word traumatic, but they find it a really deeply humiliating process. The fact that we're all here talking about normal work and improving work is still because they did something wrong from their perspective. So it is a very human thing, and you go back as early as written words exist, but certainly you can see it in legal prosecutions like the 1700s, which you can bring up online. People are very, very, very quick to admit guilt, even when it's a systems level factor.
Yeah.
And what I mean is they just weren't set up really to succeed. They didn't have the information they needed when they needed it. They might have had production pressures. The thing that was supposed to arrive this morning didn't arrive this morning. It arrived 3 hours later. All the subbies are waiting to start the work, and what arrived was the wrong piece of plant. So they just have to make do. These are the things I don't think are reflected well enough in investigation. So I agree with you about it's not picking on ICAM. It's not unique to ICAM. That's just the first investigation that I've thought of. But we don't typically go into those narratives. The narrative isn't, like I said, right in the Odyssey. It's providing enough context to actually situate what happened today, and why did it happen today, not yesterday. What was different about today? And to your point, often there isn't a whole lot of stuff that's different today as it was yesterday. And I think that's what is quite alarming to leaders when they read these sort of reports, is maybe it wasn't our level of control of the task that was problematic. Maybe we can improve our control of the energy with better engineering, but maybe I just didn't have a good enough understanding of how work was normally completed. Maybe that's the way that they've always done it, and I just didn't realize because I haven't really asked deep enough questions to actually sort of get to the crux of it.
Right, and then they feel the same emotions themselves. Because once again, I see that often around blame, that they feel that they're them being blamed because they couldn't see it coming. That's that whole thing. I mean, look, I'm doing 2 fatalities at the moment, two different circumstances, and I was with a bunch of workers the other day. Ran a little bit of a learning team, and I had their GM of safety sit in. I just said to them, look, your role's just to listen. And I said, you're gonna hear some things that are gonna be, uncomfortable, and you're gonna hear some things that are gonna be really, really, good at the same time. Because he couldn't understand why I wasn't interviewing people separately, and I said, well, I just don't. And you could see straight away that within the first 3 to 4 minutes of it, you could actually see the workers, all this tenseness just start to drop away. And at the end of it, they basically shared with me how it had been so helpful in them starting the journey of coming to terms, because in their head they had all this what if type stuff, constant what if, that classic hindsight. Or I think the problem, I call it rumination. After a certain period of time, you're looping it, and that's bad in your head. And all we really did in that learning team was to help them make sense of it. It wasn't about solutions, wasn't about this, wasn't about none of those things. It was helping them to make sense of it. And ironically, when I debriefed with the safety leader, he was amazed at how much that team actually do to make the system actually successful. Because all they were seeing were the artifacts, this checklist, these comments. When the workers took them through what actually happens, they were just blown away. And that's where I think that's the value of a learning team, and that's the value in how a learning team creates the storyboard output, is that all that rich narrative comes with it. Whereas a lot of investigations are focusing on what were the artifacts. A comment was made here. Why wasn't that followed up? See, that they actually create doubt.
Yeah, actually, just on that, I think they actually don't provide enough. So this is something I find constantly, is there'll be a statement like the procedure wasn't followed, and that's presented as a finding, but that's not a finding. Like, that's literally the start of the sentence. Like, it provides no. So even if you're following a very simple, let's say your whole worldview of the world was very mechanistic, black and white, even that doesn't fit the bill for even the most rudimentary view around performance. Like, they didn't follow the procedure, because then you're left with, okay, and like, was the procedure relevant? Did they know about it? How does it normally get done? What did they do yesterday? What's the usability of the procedure? Like, there's so many questions. Even from a linear perspective, it still doesn't tick the box around context. And this is, I actually want to throw this in. So this question around leaders feeling blame or shifting focus to the abstract system. Actually, James Reason, he argued back in 1997, maybe the pendulum has swung too far from direct active level, what he called active failures, which is the behavior of people. And maybe the pendulum swung too far towards upstream factors, which are really disconnected in space and time. Now, I think probably more realistic is it should be somewhere around the middle, or maybe not the middle, but I think there is a risk, and others have argued this, by shifting the focus towards upstream factors, we've shifted the blame from frontline operators to leaders. But that was never the intention, of course, best intentions. So I think there is a risk of that. But on the other side of it, if you look at the legal expectations, like with due diligence, the law is already clearly has a view that leaders should be doing above and beyond. They should be doing more anyway. They're the ones that control the budget, the decisions of an organization. So I think there is already an established onus on leaders that doesn't sit with workers. And the other one is, I think is important to throw out there, and I see this argument a bit on LinkedIn. Are we shifting accountability from people by blaming an abstract, ethereal system? And first, I'd say no. And it's not even like a new sort of fluffy, new view sort of view around considering the context. Like, it's existed in the human factors domain forever, since like the 1950s and 60s. They've spoken about understanding the context of work. They've also looked at behavior, absolutely. But it's always been there. And you know this, you look at the quality movement, like with Deming and others. They absolutely pushed people to understand the context, the inputs that create the outputs, not just the outputs. So I think it's not the case of just taking accountability away from frontline operators and blaming leaders or blaming the system. Maybe there's cases of that. But to understand behavior, you do absolutely also need to understand the context. And that's not a new view. Like, it's not safety differently. It's not hop to think that. Like, it's existed in other fields forever.
We are taking a break to share a message with you. If you're like me, you've probably heard the buzz about AI and wondered, can I trust it with my data? Will it undermine human judgment? Those are valid questions. That's exactly why Hop Copilot is built the way it is. Hop Copilot agents operate on Microsoft Copilot. Microsoft 365 Copilot protects your organizational data, user prompts, and responses. Your data is stored securely and remains within trusted boundaries. In Hop Copilot, ethics and people stay at the center. Use the work design and error trap analysis agent to find risky ambiguities without pointing fingers. Use the 4Ds or 4Ls worker insights agent to bring out what the front line sees. When an incident occurs, the event learning storyboard agent helps you learn with fairness and clarity. If you've doubted AI, that's okay. But imagine an AI that amplifies human wisdom, never replacing it, where your values guide every decision, and where your data is protected. That's what Hop Copilot offers. So here's what you can do now. Go to hopcopilot.com, see those agents in action. Try the free event learning storyboard or schedule a conversation about bringing the full platform into your work. Let's create safer, smarter change. Together, Hop Copilot. Where people lead, AI supports, trust follows. Now back to the podcast.
I've been reading Ishikawa's book from 1972, and he made that classic comment that when workers make mistakes, the leadership of the organization needs to take 4/5 responsibility. Now, he didn't use the word accountability or to be held to account. He's saying responsible, because what he's saying is the organization sets work up for it to go well. That's what responsibility means. You don't set people up to fail. So when work doesn't go well, you need to accept 4/5 of that. Okay, because once again, as an engineer, he gave it a friggin' number, and numbers are numbers. But he was basically saying that, and I think it's the same thing about higher duty holders. It's the same thing. It's not the worker that creates the system for work to be done. It's the job of the organization to do that. And yes, there's this constant debate about blame, accountability, and responsibility. And it's not a war that we're all going to win. I just ask the question that there's a difference between giving an account and being held to account. Okay, and HOP has never been free of holding people to account, never been its objective. But if you haven't got your house in order, don't put all of it on the worker. So it actually goes back, because once again, that goes right back to Deming's and all those other people's work, which was, don't hold them to account if your own side is ugly. Okay, and I even see, if I go back to Reason's, the culpability tree, which gets a fierce beating from time to time, there are some basic things in there that still hold true today. Would another worker done something similar under similar conditions? Was the process workable in that situation? All those things are really valid questions that we can ask.
And the legal system has used a very similar test with the substitution. Like, what would a reasonable person do in that situation? They've used that forever. And there was that original example in the UK about catching the bus, whatever the bus was in London. What would that person catching that ordinary bus have done in that situation?
Yeah. Well, even our law used to be, what would a prudent person have ought reasonably known? Okay. So if there's been some standard published in Lithuania that's behind a firewall, and the regulator is saying, well, that's what reasonable was, then how would a prudent person be able to access it?
Yeah, in fact, I covered a recent prosecution on my site that looked at reasonably practicable. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Let me just say there'd be a lot of other case law that talks about it too. But this one was interesting where they actually pointed out, the judge pointed out saying, what's reasonably practicable isn't some ethereal, philosophical, abstract concept. They said it's based purely or exclusive, or not exclusively, they said it's based on what that organization ought to have reasonably known given the situation. So what sort of work did they do? What sort of risks did they identify? What was known in industry, known by peers of theirs in industry? So they were clear, saying it's not some abstract philosophical term that you need Socrates to unpack. They make it a reasonable assessment based on the particulars of the case for that organization, that situation. So if your risk assessment says you shall implement a dozen airflow monitors, that'll be reasonably practicable. What was expected of you was to do what you said you're going to do, and they'll look at things like codes of practice and what else the industry knows. Or so yes, they hold you largely to your own accord what you said you're going to do.
And my bugbear that I see often is that they'll use standards as an example of what was reasonably practicable, when those standards sit behind a firewall that you've got to buy. So the classic one I use is around machinery safety. They're always referencing the AS4024 standards. Okay, and those standards were for designers, not for users. And this is the problem that we get. And of course, as you know, everything in hindsight looks really easy. You look to say, could I have done better? Okay. Well, in hindsight, the answer is always yes, because now you know a certain set of circumstances. But if we're so brilliant in hindsight, why are we so poor on foresight? And that's that whole challenge that we have as organizations, is how to do that. And once again, I keep going back to it, that workers are the only people that can tell you how the system is changing. Because machines, by their nature, are degrading. Preventative maintenance is the basic premise that the machine has to degrade over time. We're simply checking in to see if it's degrading as designed. Whereas sometimes in safety, we think our controls are so perfect. Yeah, see what I'm saying? So one end says we expect it to degrade. The other side, we're shocked that it degraded.
Yeah, they're going to operate first time, every time when expected. Yeah. So I did a task mapping exercise once, just as a leadership exercise. So I took the plant onboarding procedure, and I just did a mind map. I mapped, let's say the procedure says there's 4 key activities. Book the plant, receive the plant, onboard the plant, and then whatever, set up site or whatever. Because we had a whole bunch of cases where the plant wasn't being onboarded before it was used, wasn't being certified. And every investigation was like Groundhog Day with the same findings. Nothing new was being done. And I was like, why do them? If we're not learning anything, just don't do them. Anyway, so I did something different. So I mapped out the procedure, and then I just did the most obvious thing. I went out and just spent time with the workers who did the actual onboarding. And then when you actually map the things that they have to do, your 30 steps under 4 headings for a procedure is tripled. There's at least 3 times as much stuff they have to do just to do those 4 simple categories in a plan. So the 30 tasks well, it wasn't even that, it was like 20 tasks in the procedure is actually like 60 or 70 discrete things an operator has to do, or a supervisor has to do, to actually do those tasks. So like the assumption in the plan was, it said when the plant arrives, use the appropriate checklist. Okay, but when you spend time with them, it turns out that 2 times out of 5 or 6, the plant they were expecting didn't turn up. So straight away, they're already in the back foot. So that step, that perfect world step in the procedure, didn't exist. And it didn't say anything about what do you do if the wrong plant turns up. And then they only prepared a checklist for one particular piece of plant that they're expecting. So now they don't have that one. I have no means to get the one that they needed because it doesn't exist, because they have never used this plant before. It doesn't talk about what happens when the subcontractors who are charging you $5,000 an hour have been waiting for 3 hours to start the task or whatever it is. So anyway, the point is, like, there's all these perfect world assumptions in artifacts, in plans, and whatnot, that don't help us succeed. They don't necessarily help us, and they can't describe reality. But if it's something so important for the business, you would think there would be some more efforts to actually help use them as resources to actually help guide people to navigate reliable, safe expectations. But they're not very good at that.
No, they're not. And for instance, Ben, that's why I'm a fan of Agile. Okay, in terms of when you're doing that type of deployment, when you're putting a new asset in, I'm a fan because you've got a plan, you've got a goal and objective. Okay, everyone knows that there's going to be bumps along the way. Okay, so rather than waiting for the bump to happen, what I like about Agile is it's learning and adjusting as it goes. And that's what I talk to organizations about, you know? But once again, put that feedback loop in because once again, a lot of it got driven at the procurement stage or the selection stage. So why aren't you taking those learnings and feeding it back in? But in the meantime, giving the people that now have to do that deployment, giving them some form of capacity to be able to deal with those small changes. Because it's not big stuff that gets in the way. It's all the little things that get in the way. And they just compound. They just compound over time. And then workers are having to make judgments on what happens and what doesn't happen. And of course, if it goes well, we call that innovation. And if it goes wrong, it turns into blame.
Yeah, it's like a royal commission. You never have a royal commission when something hasn't blown up. No. We don't investigate yesterday when it was just an average day and we hit our targets. Like, we only ever investigate the rare occasions when things go wrong. Yeah.
Well, the criminal justice system is only based on blame and punish. Okay, because that's the reality. I do this technique with people where we show them an event that's happened. It's an AI animation. Okay, very poor animation because we want them to laugh. But it's got a whole lot of stuff involved around underlying psychosocial factors, got a whole lot of stuff around golden rules, all those things. And we asked people to basically identify what they thought were, the risk factors, the actions, the contributors, all those things, and they put them up. Okay, and they wrote a little post-it notes. Yep. And I put up 2 sheets of paper on the wall. One says blameworthy, one says praiseworthy. And I get them to put up those things, those post-it notes, into one of those 2 boxes. And would you be surprised that 90% is blameworthy and 10% is praiseworthy? That wouldn't come as a surprise, would it?
I would have expected a few more for praise, but okay, so that is a surprise, just the degree of blame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then I say to them, just imagine this event never happened. Okay, the event never happened. Which of those items in the blameworthy now become praiseworthy in normal work? Roughly, on average, 60 to 80% migrate over. Okay, and all we're doing is showing them that you have formed a bias, an unconscious bias in your head that is driving you. Yet, if the event never happened, all those things of working under pressure, all those things of working long hours, all those things now become praiseworthy. And people are just, sorry about that, people are just shocked as a result. But that's what happens. And the stuff that I'm doing, I'm just trying them to be conscious about their bias. I'm not telling them they're wrong. I'm just saying if you're conscious about your bias, then when you're doing this, that's what's going to stick in your head.
And we should clarify, we don't mean bias in a bad way. Like it's not a bug. It's just a feature of human nature that served us extraordinarily well. Like we've survived as a species because we have these heuristics, these shortcuts that we use to make patterns, make very quick inferences. And sometimes they can lead us a little bit astray. But most of the time they're very useful for optimizing. We wouldn't be able to function if we had to use our analytical processing modes in our brain. Like we wouldn't even be able to make a coffee every morning. That would take us 3 hours. So to your point, there's actually some really cool research around that too, which has been known for, or been studied for absolutely decades, since 50s and 60s at least, around. So they talk about priming, anchoring effects. Kahneman and Tversky did a lot of research around this. But I've covered a few studies recently around just how fickle perceptions are around allocations of blame. Like, so the order of the information you present, like let's say you're doing an investigation, the order that you speak to people in ultimately changes the allocations of blame. The colors that are used, the colors that people are exposed to, the language that they hear, whether you used agentive language, whether you've said like Bob broke the vase instead of the vase broke. And English particularly is a very agentive language. So agency, we're talking about agentive is agency, whereas other languages don't use a lot of agency sort of focused words. My point is, we can completely change our perception of causality. So Holnagel and Decker and others say that we don't really find causality out there in the world, complex sort of environments. We construct it. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to that, like gravity. Like, absolutely, you can find cause-effect relations with gravity, things like that. But they're talking about when we're trying to construct a really like an event on site. What you say is relevant. Like, how far back do you go? Do you go an hour? Do you go 3 days? We make judgments around what's in and out of scope, and that's based on people's own worldviews, their perceptions, their experiences. Do we include the contractors? Were they involved? They had a conversation, so do we include them? In any case, we make a lot of inferences, and it's very easy to prime that. There's a whole lot of research around just how fickle that is. I think that was a long way of saying, like, the issues of hindsight and outcome bias. And outcome bias, was another one I want to talk about quickly. So there's been research on this one. There was a really cool study actually that looked at, this was literal NASA rocket scientists were included. It's not just sort of lay people. It's an awful way to describe very experienced people, what they do, but people that aren't rocket scientists. And they had this, but these are people that could do stuff that I can't do. Like, we call them lay. It's a bizarre sort of value judgment. Anyway, this study though, they had a scenario where they were putting a satellite into space. And I won't go through all the details, but they had three versions of this scenario. One is that it proceeded as planned and succeeded. One was it had sort of a near miss event but still succeeded. And the third scenario was it failed, the mission failed. The satellite didn't appropriately start, it had a solar panel on it and didn't start collecting solar radiation. They randomly allocated engineers and administration and managers and everyone to one of these three scenarios. And what they asked was very simple. Rate the project manager's management skills. So if you got the success scenarios and the near miss scenario that was still successful, they said, oh yeah, he actually did really well. He actually recovered from a near miss, good management. But the failure, not surprisingly, they were very harsh around his performance. Yeah, he didn't manage it well. The only difference between the three scenarios was purely chance. There was no difference between the scenarios themselves, apart from the outcome was different. We can't get away from this. There's definitely things that we can do to help prime and get better to sort of explore different stories and narratives and different data streams. But outcome and hindsight biases or heuristics are still part of human nature. So you mentioned before around how some of these things, we start at the people side, like with people and whatnot. It's a very human thing to do, to look at agency of a person, because we think people have greater control around the environment. We have fundamental attribution biases where we think that, look, Bob dropped that vase because he's just a really lazy person. He doesn't care. We do that naturally. And this is why I think it's so important to explore some of these better human-centered principles, is we have to kind of try and rebalance it, rather, because we already naturally look for internal sort of characteristics and blame. We don't need any more help doing that. Like, we're already very efficient at doing that. And there's been very important reasons to do that. If we evolve to be in large communities, like 100 people, let's say, you need a quick way to judge someone's trustworthiness. Are they going to put a spear in your back? So we made very quick attributions that normally served us pretty well, but probably not so much now in the construction
that's why I
environment.
used to put in the town centre the cross that everyone got burnt on. at some
Oh,
point.
is that how it works? Okay.
Well, because it's an
I mean, it still
indicator,
works
isn't
for
it?
us, though.
Yeah,
Let me be clear. They still largely work in our favor. We still have to make very quick judgments around
Yeah.
people based on intuition, but they can come astray in certain circumstances, particularly when we try and apply very linear analytical sort of perspectives, like incident investigations.
Thanks so much for joining me on this journey with Hop into Action. I've loved sharing stories, ideas, and practical ways to do safety differently with you. Your support and curiosity are what make this community so strong, and I want to thank you for being part of it. If you're ready to keep building capability, capacity, and resilience, I'd encourage you to check out the Hop Beginner's Guide series on Amazon. Each volume is short, practical, and packed with insights, and the book series is designed for busy people who want real impact, not theory. This isn't the end of the conversation, just the next step in your journey. So thank you again for listening, for learning, for supporting better work. Until next time, remember, small changes, shared stories, and thoughtful practice lead to big results with HOP, learning teams, and the 4Ds.
We learn that people slip, it's only human. Errors show the path to grow and we're improving. Context shapes the way we do our best work. Focus on the system, no blame can hold us back. 5 hop principles lifting us higher. Learning without blame, fueling our fire. Together we grow, together we thrive. Keeping operational excellence alive.